In this chapter, we'll talk about the government policies and its effectiveness on the ISLM curve. We understand from our basic economics in high school that when it comes to government policies, the government can increase their spending, or the government can increase their taxation, or the government can increase the money supply. The government can increase the money supply. And therefore, all of these things we know that will impact the GDP in the economy. When the government spending increases, GDP in the economy increases. And when the money supply increases, the GDP or the total income in the economy also increases. However, what we did not study in high school is that what happens to why does the GDP increase? What is happening to the economics that the GDP is actually, why is it increasing? What is the causation? And for that, we have to understand the different policies of the government and how do they affect the ISLM curve. When it comes to the effectiveness of this policy, that has to deal with the elasticity of the ISLM curve, which is something that I'll discuss in the next video. Before we can talk about the policies and how do they impact the ISLM curve, let's just look at what causes the ISLM curve to shift. We know that the ISLM curve of the interest rate over here, we have the total income, interest rate, total income. We know that the ISLM curve is at equilibrium when our total economy or the total GDP in the economy is also in equilibrium, which is represented by consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net import and exports. So if any of these factors increase or decrease, this is going to cause an increase or decrease in the LM curve. When the consumption increases, people have more money to spend, therefore the demand for money increases, therefore the LM curve shifts to the right. The same thing goes with interest. However, we are not going to focus on consumption and interest in investment as much, because these are not the policies, these are not directly controlled by the government. The government directly controls government spending, and we understand when the government spending increases, the IS curve would shift to the right. When the government spending increases, the IS curve shifts to the right. Now, why does that happen? We know when the government spending increases, our marginal propensity to consume would also increase. And if the marginal propensity to consume increases, our marginal propensity to save would decrease, because we know that marginal propensity to save is MPC, which is propensity to consume minus 1 minus marginal propensity to consume. So when the marginal propensity to save decreases, the IS curve shifts to the right. This has to do with how the IS curve is derived. So it is important that you understand how we derive these two curves. The IS curve shifts to the right when the marginal propensity to consume decreases. This happens when the government spending increases. The same can be said about investment, which we'll get to that in a second. But when the government spending increases, our investments naturally increase. This causes a rightward shift in the IS curve. And we can look at it from an inverse perspective also. When the government spending decreases, the IS curve will shift to the left. When it comes to net imports and exports, this is not something which is talked a lot in this chapter, because it's something that is more common in modern economics and not the Keynesian economics. But the logic is still the same. When the imports are high, the IS curve will shift to the left, because people are spending, the marginal propensity to import is high. When the imports are less and the exports are high, the marginal propensity to import is low. Therefore, the curve will shift to the right. When it comes to the LM curve, we know that there's only one major factor that causes the LM curve to shift, which is your money supply. When the money supply increases, the LM curve shifts to the right. Why does that happen? Because we understand that when the money supply increases, we have the money demand. From the liquidity preference theory, when the money supply increases, let's call it MS1, and let's call this point MS2. When the money supply increases, the interest rate drops, and when the interest rate drops, people have more, the investment drops, and people's transactional and the precautionary motive increases, and the speculative demand decreases, because speculative demand has an inverse relationship with interest. So when the interest rate drops, the speculation increases, and when the speculation increases, the money demand in the economy also increases, and therefore the LM curve shifts to the right. and we can set the other, we can look at it the other way around when the LM curve shifts to the left. So this is the first introduction that we have to understand. This is not something technically mentioned in this chapter. This is part of the previous chapter. However, if we can understand it in this chapter to begin with, it makes our problem solving a lot more easier. So now let's talk about the first effect. I've taken the graphs straight from the book so that it's easier for everyone to follow along. When the money supply increases, we know that the LM curve shifts to the right, therefore the income would increase and therefore the interest rate would drop. However, what we need to understand is why does that happen? What is the reasoning behind it? And the reasoning behind is very simple. When our LM curve shifts to the right because of increase in money supply, our interest rate is going to fall. The interest rate would fall because our speculative demand and our speculative demand, transactional demand will increase simultaneously, because when the money supply increases, people have more money in their hands. So let's say my initial income was $100, and when the money supply increased, my total money in my hand in nominal terms, my money would increase, let's say from 100 to, let's make it $200. And when I have more money in my hand, naturally my transactional, meaning my expenses, my money that I need for my daily expenses would increase, and the money I keep for emergency, which is precautionary motive, would also naturally increase. And also we know that when you have more money in hand, you would be willing to invest more money, therefore your speculative demand would also increase. When our speculative and our money demand, speculative and our transactional and precautionary motive increases, this causes a decrease in our interest rate because our money demand increases. If I draw simple money demand to interest rate diagram, if this is your money supply, if the money supply increases, call it the point, we know that the interest rate would drop. When the interest rate drops, therefore the cost of borrowing decreases. When the cost of borrowing decreases, our investment increase. Or you can even look at it from consumption perspective. When our money supply increases, we have the interest rate drops, so people's cost of borrowing decreases, so people start borrowing more money, and people, when they borrow more money, they will consume, their consumption will increase, their spending would increase, and when that happens, our income would increase from Y0 to Y1. A very simple correlation. Let me summarize it again. When our LM curve shifts to the right, our interest rate drops. When the interest rate drops, the cost of borrowing, let's call it cost of borrowing decreases. When the cost of borrowing decreases, people's consumption increase, people's investment. When I talk about investment, we specifically talking about induced investment over here. So the investment would increase, therefore the income would go from Y0 all the way to Y1. A very simple, straightforward correlation. The next example given in the book is that of increase in government spending. So what happens when the government spending increases? We know from the introduction that when the government spending increases, it has an increase, or it causes the IS curve to shift to the right. So the IS curve is going from point A, so the equilibrium point is going from point A all the way to point B, something that we clearly understand. However, what we do need to understand are two things. Why does the income go from Y0 to Y1 and not from Y0 to, let's say, Y*1? What is the causation for that? And the second thing is, why does the interest rate increase when there's an increase, when the IS curve shifts to the right? We understand that when the IS curve shifts to the right, therefore our spending, to be very specific, when the IS curve shifts to the right, we know from our basic theory, when the government spending increases, our consumption and our investment will also increase. Our consumption goes up, our induced investment would also go up, and therefore we would have an increase from Y0 to Y1. But what we need to learn is, why do we have Y0 to Y1, and why do we not have a change from y0 all the way to y star 1. So the equilibrium is going from A to B, but why doesn't it go from, let's say, A to, let's call this point C? Why doesn't it go from A to C? And the reason is, when the government spending increases, we have a crowding out effect. We have a crowding out effect, and which essentially means when the government spending increases, besides the government spending, we also have an increase in interest rate, and when the interest rate increases, the cost of borrowing increases, so because you have to pay more money, therefore the investment, or to be very specific, the autonomous investment decreases, and therefore because of this crowding out effect, we see that the economy would increase but not increase significantly, because when the interest rate increases, your speculative demand would decrease, and therefore we would have an increase in income but not by a significant amount. A very simple, straightforward relationship. Crowding out effect is explained in more detail in the previous chapter, so if you don't really understand it, I think you should probably revise the previous chapter first. The next effect is that of increase in taxation. You have to understand, increase in taxation, increase in government spending is the opposite of taxation, and increase in taxation is the opposite of government spending. They both are opposites of each other. Opposites in what sense? Opposites in the sense of economic impact. So whatever we study for increase in government spending, just flip it around, inverse it for understanding the effect of increase in taxation. Increasing government spending will cause the IS curve to shift to the right. So therefore, the increase in taxation, assuming that the government spending is constant, would cause the IS curve, instead of shifting to the right, will shift towards the left. And the equilibrium would go from point B to point A, and the same logic would apply over here. Why doesn't it go from point B all the way to point C? Meaning the income, we know that the income is gonna drop, but why does income drop a little bit and not significantly? This is again due to the crowding out effect, because when the taxation increases, the interest rate falls, and when the interest rate falls, we understand that the cost of borrowing decreases. When the cost of borrowing decreases, people borrow more money, therefore the consumption increases, and when the consumption increases, therefore our induced investment will increase, and therefore our income would drop, but would not drop significantly, because these two will cause the income to increase, but it would not increase by a significant amount. In the classical economics, we used to assume that it would increase by a significant amount, and therefore in the long run it will come back into equilibrium. However, in Keynesian economics, we understand that although the income increases because of the crowding out effect, it does not increase to a degree enough to bring it back into equilibrium. So therefore the income is going to overall drop, but it would not drop by a significant amount, meaning it would go from B to A, or y0 to y1, and not all the way to y3. So this is the third impact of the government policy. The fourth is the impact of the induced investment. Let me quickly add that one. The last and final one is the effect of increase in investment, and to be specific, we are talking about increase in autonomous investment, because we know that the government can only impact the autonomous part of investment. When the government spending increase, because of the multiplier effect, the autonomous investment would also increase. So when we are talking about increase in investment, we are very specific, talking about increase in autonomous investment. When the increase in autonomous investment takes place, our IS curve shifts to the left, and therefore our income decreases. Why does that happen? We know when the autonomous investment increases, therefore your interest rate is going to drop, or when the autonomous investment decreases, the interest rate would increase. Now why is that happening? The relationship is very simple and very straightforward. The last and final one mentioned is that of investment, and when we are talking about investment, we have to be very specific. We are talking about autonomous investment only, because the government can only impact autonomous investment due to the multiplier effect. The government has no say in the induced investment, and we understand that when the autonomous investment decreases, the IS curve would shift to the left. Now why is that happening? The IS curve will shift to the left for very same reason as we did for government spending. We know that the government's increase in government spending causes the IS curve to shift to the right, and decrease in government spending would cause the IS curve to shift towards the left. Just like government spending, we know that y is equal to c plus I plus g. So if the government spending increases, the IS curve shifts to the right. When the investment increases, the IS curve shifts to the right. However, if both of them decrease, or if the investment decrease, the IS curve will shift to the left. The main thing that we have to learn is why does it go from y0 to y1 and not, let's say, from all the way from y0 to y2. This is because, again, because of the crowding out effect. When the autonomous, you have to emphasize the word autonomous over here. We know that the investment has two parts. Y is equal to mx plus c. This is your linear equation because it is a linear function. In this linear function, c represents the autonomous part and m represents the induced part. Induced part is the part which the people spend. So let's say if I have $100, if my income is $100, maybe from the $100 I'm investing, let's say, $30. This is my autonomous investment, and the rest of the investment depends on the income. If the income increases, maybe right now I'm investing $70. Let's say my income increases from, I don't know, 100 to, let's say, $150. My autonomous investment would remain the same. However, maybe my induced investment would increase. The point is induced investment, it has a direct relationship with income. If the income increases, the induced investment decreases. When there is a decrease in autonomous investment, our interest rate falls because the IS curve shifts to the left, and this causes an increase in induced investment increases. And this is the reason the curve goes from IS0, so got it over here, IS0 to IS1 and not all the way to Y3, meaning the income will drop from Y0 to Y1 but not from Y0 all the way to Y2. And when we combine all of, so we have studied 4 policies thus far. We have studied the effect on taxation, the effect of government spending, the effect on investment, and the effect on the money supply. When we combine all of them, we can increase the income, but by not changing the interest rate significantly. How can we do that? When we increase our government, when the government increases the money supply, this causes the LM curve to shift to the right. And if the government can increase the money supply, meaning if the government can implement monetary policy, because monetary policy deals with money supply, and simultaneously if the government also increases their spending, and both of these is gonna cause the IS and LM curve to shift to the right. And if you can see from the diagram, it's also given in the book, when both of them increase simultaneously, our interest rate will remain the same. However, our income would fall. And this is what they're implementing in America right now. In America, I think 3 months ago, they released a fiscal policy of $3 trillion. That's a lot of money. And they also injected a lot of money into the economy, meaning they increased their government spending. They also increased their money supply so that they can keep the interest rate constant and at the same time try to increase total income in the economy. We can also look at the other way around. If we decrease the money supply and decrease the government spending or increase taxation, because taxation and government spending are inverse of each other, we can have the same effect. The interest rate would remain the same, however the income would be affected. Long story short, the government can implement different policies to influence the interest rate and the income in the economy. All governments are trying to do is they're trying to keep the interest rate stable. They're trying to keep the interest rate stable, but they also want to increase the total income in the economy. And by combining these policies, they can ensure how that can happen. The next part of the chapter deals with the effectiveness, how effective these policies would be, and that effectiveness depends on the elasticity of the IS-LM curve, which is something that I will discuss in the next video.